Hey, everybody, quick note before we get to the podcast today, and that is that this is an Earth Day special for 2023. It's actually a repeat of the Earth Day special we did in 2022, but we had so many positive comments from you, our listeners, about our conversation with Karen Washington, such a motivational person, we decided to re-air this for the Earth Day special 2023.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rory McGuire. I'm a professor and extension specialist at Virginia Tech, and I am for the soil because the soil is our future. We don't make any more of it. If you eat, you rely on soil.
Welcome to For the Soil, a conversation. I'm your host, Jeff Ishii. Well, my goodness, we have been now doing this podcast for several months, and we have had the opportunity to have a conversation with several very interesting people over the last several months. And one of those interesting people we invited back today for an Earth Day special. Her name is Karen Washington, and she's a very inspiring person. Her life story is just so interesting, and how she got involved with agriculture and horticulture and involved in soil health. Well, I'll let her tell that story, but she is a very interesting person. Before we get started, would like to remind everyone that we have a lot of information at our website, forthesoil.org. That's the digit 4, thesoil.org. Just go to that website and you'll find lots of information. Well, let's now go to the podcast. This is a best of edition with Karen Washington, an Earth Day special with Mary Sketch, Eric Benfelt, Karen Washington, and myself. You're such an interesting person. You have an interesting story, and a lot of people have been or are in your shoes, and they are looking for inspiration, and they want to know how you did it.
Not only that, you know what I find so amazing is not my relationship, what I have with young people, but now I'm getting, a lot of conversation, a lot of requests from elders. Elders all of a sudden, like they're in their 40s or 50s or 60s, and they want to go back to the land. They want to farm now. I'm 67. I'll be 68 this year. And it's remarkable, because I tell people my age, I want them to understand that, that life doesn't end, in your 20s or 30s, that there's a new chapter, especially when you get up in age. And so now I'm hearing from people in their 50s and 60s that want to go back to the land and want to farm and have those juices, stirring again, which is so, so incredible. So I am enjoying this life that I'm leading, inspiring so many, not only young people, now the elders are coming out of the woodwork and now they want to farm.
And yeah, Karen, well, I've always been inspired by you, and and then I still remember running into you at the airport over in Charlottesville. And then, the idea of the writing, that just over COVID, that I've been trying to write my wife's aunts on a weekly basis, and also sharing some poetry. Often it's related to nature or the land, and whether it's Wendell Berry or Mary Oliver or Ted Kooser. And it's interesting that aunts are 85 and 90, but just talking about reflections on my grandmother or growing up, and how that brings out more conversation about whether it's sewing or gardening or taking walks in nature. And so just really encourage you in your writing there.
I'll take it.
Let me ask one other question. If you were talking to a fourth grade class of students, urban students, who for the first time in their life, they've seen how a tomato is grown. Talk to that class for just a moment and tell them what they can expect by adopting a hobby of gardening, or perhaps ultimately farming.
So I always start with like, so where do you think your food comes from? And especially like a tomato, because a tomato is what really, really got me started. And so they would say, from a grocery store? And I said, what, from a grocery store? I don't think so. Let me tell you how I got started, because I too believed that everything was coming from a grocery store until someone told me, you know what? It comes from the soil. You put a seed in the ground and you cover it with soil and you put water on it and you have sun and you watch it grow. And long and behold, guess what I saw? I saw this red thing that I thought was pink. It was round and it grew on a vine. Can you believe it? It grew on a vine. And then when it was ready and it was red, I picked it and I bit into it, and woo, the juices that were flowing. What? I couldn't imagine. It tastes like a fruit. And guess what? A tomato is a fruit. So I challenge you all to think about something that you like the most, putting a seed in the ground and nurturing it. And hopefully you can have the experience I had growing my first tomato that changed my world.
Excellent. Again, I'm headed right out to the garden right after.
And it did. And that's how I got started with the tomato. I hated tomatoes. And it was a tomato that changed my world. The taste, it was like, what?
What's your opinion? We read about urban agriculture all the time, and we see terms like vertical agriculture, hydroponics, of course. Where do you see us going in that realm? Is it possible for an inner city to produce its own food supply?
So I want to stop you right there, because I think people think about that, people in urban areas are going to grow all their food now on rooftops and vertical walls and community garden. They're going to feed the masses. No, that's not going to be the case. The thing is that we have to be intentional about who's growing, what is growing, and there is room for everybody to grow something, And so I want to start with that. I just had a conversation before I left New York, because they're starting to open up an urban ag office. And so I wanted to make sure that when that happens, that there's room for all types of growing food. The bottom line is, how can we get healthy food into the stomachs of people that need it the most? How do we get people to understand the relationship to food, to land, to soil? How do we get people to be conscientious consumers, fighting for the rights to have soil fertility, not soil that's laced with chemicals, not soil that is contaminated? How do we start having those hard conversations? And it starts within inner cities to have that relationship back to land, back to soil, but then also understanding where their food comes from. And so if you are growing in a plot, on a roof, or on a vertical, or in a greenhouse, we need to start having those conversations, how there's different techniques of growing food. But at the bottom line, we're growing food because people need to eat healthy. And another conversation that we need to have and tear down that barrier when we talk about organic food. Because again, in peoples of color, they feel organic is privileged food, it's white people's food, it's rich, and we have to sort of be cognizant on how we use words and terms that keep people out, that make people don't understand. And when we talk about climate change and we talk about soil fertility, how can that resonate to the people who are going to be impacted the most? And so within my talks, when we talk about social science and we talk about academics and we talk about these topics, we have to engage in the conversation with community. We have to embrace community. We have to make sure that communities that are impacted the most understand why bad soil impacts them, why climate change impacts them, and do it in such a way that they have ownership of that. They have ownership of their own community. They understand the harm that soil infertility has, that climate change has, in a way that they feel that they can be part of the change, part of the solution, instead of always feeling part of the problem. Time and time again, communities of colors are always viewed as problems. They need to be fixed. Something's wrong. Instead of embracing, like, okay, given the power to make change, how can you be part of the solution? Time and time again, communities of colors are always viewed as problems. They need to be fixed. Something's wrong. Instead of embracing, like, okay, given the power to make change, how can you be part of the solution? And then how can you have social scientists and soil scientists and academics coming and to embrace communities with a different approach and a different language that's meaningful for them? And right now, to be honest with you, it is hard when you have this epidemic, this pandemic happening that is ravaging so many communities. And so you can talk about climate change, you can talk about health, where they're dealing with the virus. They're dealing with this virus. So let's sort of calm down. Let's meet people where they are. Because for me, in order to talk about soil health and environmental justice, I have to say that in order to fight this disease, eating healthy is being healthy. And so understanding that what you're putting in your body can help stem the tide to fight this virus, it starts with having those hard conversations about eating healthy. And then sort of talking about, what does that look like, eating healthy? Where are you getting your food? Are you growing your food? Are you asking questions when you go to the grocery store? Are you seeing food that, that doesn't look healthy? Should you be eating it? Are you asking questions? So that's where I'm coming from. And that's where I'm coming from, not only as a farmer, but also as a community person, and understanding how soil and how food has impacted my community.
Mary, do you have any other questions?
No, I just, I love that, Karen, because, I feel like what I'm hearing too is how it's more than just the act of growing the food. It's those experiences that are empowering, and tying in the cultural components and using that as a means to, highlight why healthy food is important. And there's so much more that comes out of it than the food that is grown out of the ground.
One thing I tell when I speak to young people, I say to them time and time again, if you're lucky to have grandparents, great-grandparents, abuelo, take out those Samsung Galaxies and those iPhones and capture their story, their history of what it was growing food on the land. Have them talk about what it was to be in Puerto Rico or the Dominican Republic or Jamaica, or Mexico or in the Deep South. And have them talk about what it was where they got their food. They didn't go to a supermarket, and capture those stories, because it's part of your history, part of who you are. Because I say to them, if you don't capture that history, 10, 20 years from now, they'll tell your family never got food from the land. Everything came from a grocery store.
And Karen, you've been recognized for your leadership in environmental issues, food system issues, and I was once told that we need to increase our educational footprint as well as our leadership footprint. I'd like to hear your perspective on where you see or how we can do that.
Well, the thing about it, I sit back and I hear all these iterations about, now it's regenerative agriculture and it's this agriculture. And it's like, wait a second, people have been growing food from the land for years. We never had those hard conversations around indigenous principles. We tend to co-opt things. We co-opt and we make it our own, and it's brand and it's new. And we don't sit down and listen to other people's way of farming, even if they bring in spirituality. A lot of people bring in the spirit of growing food, but yet Western society would look at it as, voodoo, and there's certain aspects of indigenous qualities that are now resonating, but yet being co-opted as something new. And we need to start to have those conversations of, stop putting your ideas of something new and listen to how people have been growing food for centuries. You know what I'm saying? We just all of a sudden just wake up and say, oh, so there's a problem with carbon. Don't you think carbon has been a problem for so long, especially when man went from hunter-gatherings to agriculture, that carbon has been emitted into the air? It's not like, oh, all of a sudden we got cars now and now we have carbon in the air. No, or that there's been problem with barren soil. I mean, people knew back in the day that if you don't treat the soil right, if you don't treat Mother Nature right, she's going to come after you. You know what I'm saying? She's going to come after you, and she's coming after us. You know what? And so when are we going to start listening? When are we going to start listening to all that is happening around the world and say, wait a second, Mother Nature knows better. Let's listen to her. Why do we try to reinvent what Mother Nature has been doing? Why do we add fertilizers? Mother Nature knows how to do her own fertilization. But yet, as humans, we always feel that we know better and that we have to add things to make things better, instead of like, hands off. Let's listen to Mother Nature. There's knowledge there. Let's see what she's telling us. When changes happen in the soil, what does that mean? The soil, listening to Mother Nature, she can tell you if it's too much going on in terms of if the soil is anaerobic or aerobic. Mother Nature can tell you if there is overproduction of weeds. The weeds themselves can tell you your soil structure, your soil fertility, what's missing, what needs. And at the end of the day, Mother Nature is saying, I don't want my soil to be barren. I want my soil to be covered, because just like you get a chill and you want a warm blanket, Mother Nature's saying the same thing.
And that concludes this episode of For the Soil, a Conversation. The words of Karen Washington, so appropriate for this Earth Day. Sometimes we as farmers, we as gardeners, and just everyday citizens of the earth, sometimes we just need to stop and listen to the land. See what she's telling us. I want to thank Eric Benfelt and also Mary Sketch Bryant for their participation in this special episode for Earth Day 2022. For the Soil, a Conversation is made possible with funding support from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and the Agua Fund. Other partners include the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service, Virginia Cooperative Extension, Virginia State University, Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation, and partners of the Virginia Soil Health Coalition. Views expressed on this podcast are those of each individual guest. To download a copy of this or any other episode, visit the website forthesoil.org. That's the digit 4, thesoil.org. And if you should have a specific question about soil health, contact your local extension office, your local USDA service center, or a Soil and Water Conservation District office. Music used during today's program was provided courtesy of The Flip Charts and Coddington Bear. All rights reserved. For the Soil, a Conversation is produced by On the Farm Radio in collaboration with Virginia Tech. I'm your host, Jeff Ishii.